Our next presenter, Reverend Curtis Hart, who is a medical ethicist at Cornell College of Medicine, and he is going to be talking about, in this very complex landscape, all these different issues, both religious, a-religious, moral issues. Now we've just heard from Dr. Shanawani discussing all these very complex issues about conscience subjection. How do we teach medical ethics to young professionals? It's something that I actually did not get any specific training in, and so it begs some different answers to maybe some of Dr. Shanawani's questions. So I'd like to welcome Reverend Hart to the podium for his discussion, Pedagogy and Purpose, Moral Imagination, the Teaching of Medical Ethics.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure whether there's going to be any slides up here, but not to worry. I'm sure that the materials can be emailed to you out of the PDF. But let me talk to you at least about some of these issues having to do with pedagogy and purpose in the teaching of and moral imagination. And I'd like to begin by talking very briefly. I'm going to skip my slightly puckish introduction from Lewis Carroll, one of my favorite authors, who brings nothing into focus but is delightful nonetheless, and to move ahead and talk for just a bit about how I came to even think about this issue. And I started thinking about it a number of years ago when I was in conversation with the spouse of one of my oldest friends, who was for many years now an emeritus professor at New England College, who was discussing with me, about what it meant to be able to think about outcomes in the teaching of the humanities, and particularly in music. And he was frankly stumped by this to a certain extent, and I never forgot that conversation. I don't know whether you've ever had the experience, and this presentation is geared on this, of things that have stuck in your mind and are important, and sometime you come to actually consider them seriously. Now, about the time that I was involved in this discussion, I was also involved in a task force, or in fact two commissions or committees that were part of curriculum change and review at Weill Cornell Medical College, having to do with humanities and medicine and professionalism. And so from those things, I was made to be more aware of both those issues as important touchstones for what goes forward, and in fact provided some of the motivation and the resources for the remarks that follow. And the second important motivating factor here came with my realization that though I have read numerous papers, and some of them are very informative, you can go to the web and find a lot. I quote a couple of here about the endpoints and the virtues of medical ethics courses in one sort or another in undergraduate medical education. There really weren't very many, if no studies, that talked about what happened to us who do it. What were the stages that happened for those of us who engaged in this particular experience? Now, I've done a good deal of teaching in medical ethics over the years, and I feel privileged to do so. I should add also that some of you know the Cornell University's in Ithaca, the medical colleges in the Upper East Side of New York City, at what was once known as the New York Hospital, now the New York Presbyterian Hospital. But I've been involved in teaching in the second-year course in medical ethics for medical students for some years, and I've always done it in conjunction in small group leadership with a physician colleague. So we have been part of a twosome that has instructed small groups of students. And I'm also involved in a seminar where these issues come up, in a course having to do with spiritual issues at the end of life in their palliative care course. Now, it's interesting that I'm well aware that numbers of my faculty colleagues share with me an interest and a stimulation to do this kind of work. But to my knowledge, I don't think we have ever, as a group, discussed what it has meant for us or how it has changed us. And frankly, I have over time come to believe that there is more to continuing the activity of teaching medical ethics than simply being good at it. And frankly, I would like to know why. Now, this exploration, we'll hear now is going forward, is not based on qualitative or quantitative research, though I believe or hope that some of the issues that I present here may provoke some brave soul to go forward and use it as a touchstone, as a point of reference or departure, a prompting to go forward. I should say that I have spent over 20 years on Cornell's IRB, which has been a very profitable experience, and therefore, I'm aware of the research process. Also, I'm the editor of the Journal of Religion and Health, that some of you may know. And in that role, that editorial role, I get research articles by the barrelful now that come to me and which involve research topics. I should also say that in my years as editor, more and more of these articles have come from the Islamic world and Islamic scholarship, and following Professor Inhorn, a goodly number of them come from Iran. It's an interesting sort of cultural commentary. And the fact is, I therefore am aware of how hard it is to do good research, and how indeed I would like to see some people go ahead and do this, and to be able to investigate at greater depth the issue that I would now like to have us join. Moral imagination. Moral imagination demands some sort of working definition. And frankly, one can find a variety of definitions related to the humanities, no matter, depending on where you look. And David Dukas, who is a physician and a professor of medical humanities, in a recent article said the following: one way in which the study of literature can result in productive discomfort for students, note the phrase productive discomfort, is by critically integrating the meaning of professionalism, and thus help learners discover how to frame such questions and debate different answers. Precisely how this happens is not fully circumscribed, to be sure, but some scholars have argued that in part students have become adept at both asking questions and exploring answers through the development of moral imagination, which is defined, and they note this, Professor Carson, as the heightened capacity to envision experience, whether one's own or someone else's, from a different perspective. It also facilitates empathetic orientation by encouraging emotional connectedness with or recognition of characters different from oneself, and health-related roles different from one's own. And literary critic and biographer David Bromwich, who teaches at Yale, has said the following in his recent book of essays that is in fact entitled Moral Imagination. Professor Bromwich: I write to defend the human faculty which several of the writers I most admire, Wordsworth, Ruskin, Gandhi, Virginia Woolf, and Martin Luther King, among others, have made us think of as moral imagination. For this is the power that compels us to grant the highest possible reality and the largest conceivable claim to a thought, action, or person that is not our own and not close to us in any obvious way. For moral imagination, therefore, seems to me inseparable from the freedom that is possible in society. Now, the texts to which Professor Bromwich and Professor Dukas allude are literary, of course, but I believe they could also be understood as the equivalents of the medical ethics cases, that is, which become both in life and in discussion and in courses, texts in themselves that are shared by teachers and students. For moral imagination, here sounds, at first glance, something very much like therapeutic empathy that the psychoanalyst Hans Kohut defines as vicarious introspection. Vicarious introspection. And yet it seems to me that moral imagination, while intimate and personal on the one hand, has a social dimension that requires putting ideas into action. For David Bromwich supports this claim in his essays on Edmund Burke, Abraham Lincoln, and Reinhold Niebuhr, whose greatness was in part defined by their common capacity to use their moral imaginations to proclaim truths that each in their own way would, in Niebuhr's very famous formulation, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. For moral imagination demands an understanding of what a patient or family member is saying or wants to say at a moment of crisis. Such listening, responding, and comprehending occasions the necessity for the airing of viewpoints that may be problematic, obvious, but yet in the same sense oftentimes unwelcome. That is, I think the patient wants this, let's ask her or her surrogate again. I'm not sure we should do this yet. Or when I ask students to describe an experience related to death and mortality as part of the seminar I teach in their course in palliative care, some are given to respond, I left wondering that occasion why we kept on doing this. But how does moral imagination evolve, become part of one's vocation, and find expression in the learning and the teaching of medical ethics? Now, some years ago, in a series of conversations with William Anderson, who was at that time the vice president of the Episcopal Church Foundation in New York, whom I'd gotten to know through being the interim clergy person in his parish church, shared with me foundation research that presented a broadened concept of theological education. In sum, a result of the Foundation's research demanded that the concept of theological education, and this is, of course, in a mainline Protestant church, needed to be expanded beyond the 3-year post-baccalaureate program. Its sweep needed to begin with the period prior to a formal decision to enter theological education, particularly after the time a clear conscious choice had been made to come, quote, under care, unquote, which is the generalized term, the generic term for declaring one's intentions to one's local church, religious body, and one's judicatory, one's denomination. For the individual then moves on to the formal 3 years or more of study in pursuit of ordination or additional graduate training. And last, theological education should be conceived, that's stage 1, stage 2, and last, theological education should be conceived as including the first 5 years of post-ordained life, during which time behaviors, attitudes, and skills are tested, refined, strengthened, and frankly occasionally modified or replaced as they coalesce into an integrated, stable professional identity. For this concept of professional development that I've just talked about may seem less than revolutionary or trailblazing at this point in time, but most of what was then articulated, in fact, has been reaffirmed in more recent Foundation research. Now, this projected 3-phase stage of professional development, I believe, is congruent with what happens in the life and work of those of us who are chosen to or choose to be involved in medical ethics education. There is a period before one enters into the field whose experience contributes to a future sense of vocation. I'm given to say it this way when I address this issue with second-year medical students in the session that I share with them in their medical ethics course. And I quote William Sloane Coffin, whom even the students from Yale don't know about because he for many years was the chaplain at Yale and was prominent nationally in the civil rights movement and other places. But I quote Mr. Coffin, by the Reverend Mr. Coffin, this way: ethics are more caught than taught. Ethics are more caught than taught. I continue. Your parents, brothers and sisters, other family, your friends and teachers and religious leaders have already instilled in you by word and example what it means to be an ethical person. What we can give you here in this class is language, a framework, and set of examples that could help you form and shape what is already there. A similar period of preparation is true for those whose futures include teaching medical ethics. This period is then followed by a course of professional training that brings ethical issues to light in both formal academic ways and more informally in dialogue with peers and instructors. For the conclusion of this second stage, and this is the formal part of one's training, the academic post-baccalaureate training, so to say, is marked for both medicine and the ministry through its own rites of passage, the proclaiming of ordination vows and the taking of the Hippocratic Oath. Other professions have their own rituals marking a similar vocational transformation. And then follows the early period of professional life with its own responsibilities and ethical learning. You're finally into residency, you're finally into your first parish church or its equivalent, and then you come to test and work through, ideally under some kind of meaningful supervision, what you've learned. And it is the place where professional behaviors and attitudes get sorted out and become more solid, more dependable. And one of the potential results, the outcomes of this accrued experience, is an interest in the teaching of medical ethics. I think this interest is born out of this three-tiered process, and that is the supposition that this essay is based on. In the research of this presentation, I recalled the following quotation that caught my attention when I first read it as part of the curriculum reform efforts at Weill Cornell. And it comes from the summary article, Calls for Reform of Medical Education by the Carnegie Foundation for Advancement of Teaching, 1910 through 2010, otherwise known as Flexner II. It is conceived as the follow-up of the Flexner study that completely revolutionized medical education earlier in the last century. The writers of the Carnegie report say as follows: formation, a term borrowed from our colleagues in the study of the clergy, involved the process of becoming a professional through expanding one's knowledge, understanding, and skillful performance through engagement with other members of the profession, particularly more experienced others, and by deepening one's commitment to the values and disposition of the profession into habits of the mind and heart. Here the authors are referring to Carnegie's simultaneous and similar investigation into the training and education of clergy. And there is also, interestingly, a similar Carnegie study dedicated to nursing. And all three of these studies, medicine, clergy, and nursing, stress the importance of professional education, providing coherent and intentional integration of theory and practice, where academic training relates effectively with professional work in real time. It's where theory and practice begin to rub up against one another, and they become foundational to one's life going forward. Now, the key phrase of the report quoted above is habits of the mind and heart, for it captures the essence of moral imagination. For it is what? It is habitual, something that happens by instinct and is accessible to all, not just the chosen few, not necessarily just a kind of people who have a kind of gnosis, a special knowledge, but it is, accessible to all, and it involves both the mind and the heart, the intellect and the spirit. It is empathic in character and compels reaching out into the world. It does not avoid conflict and acknowledges doubt. In fact, embracing ambiguity and uncertainty as opportunities rather than adversaries is key to teaching and learning medical ethics. And insofar, those of us who've done that have been able to incorporate that mental attitude that somehow we hope gets communicated. And I think I think of the student who proclaimed, When I first read this case, says as he enters the room, I thought it was all very obvious, but now I am not so sure. And the teacher in all of us goes, yes. Or there is the student who said that he did not think he would get much out of this second-year course of medical ethics, but later somewhat ruefully admitted to me that he actually liked it. Now, at the time, he was searching for a topic for his paper at the end of the course. And I knew something about his background, and I asked, you know, I didn't know you did a couple of years of research before you came here. Did you ever see anything there in that setting that troubled you or made you uneasy? His eyes brightened, and in a mild shock of recognition, he responded, yes. My comment was, then this is your topic. Or there was the woman student whom I met on the street after the summer she got married, who with great exuberance showed me her wedding pictures. There's Uncle Stanley and Aunt Rose under the chuppah. Having these moments is one of the great perks of the job, when you get to share these moments even directly with your students. This happy meeting concluded with her telling me the following. And guess what, Reverend Hart? I was working in the emergency room when we admitted a patient with placenta previa who refused a cesarean section, and we had to work hard to get her to trust us enough so that we could persuade her to have the procedure. It was just like the case in our medical ethics class. You know, sometimes life does imitate art. But how does all this knowledge and experience about ethics become part of one's vocation and part of one's moral imagination? It is an organic evolutionary process and is rooted in one's inner life and dialogue with outer experience. It ebbs and flows, it builds and develops, utilizing an imagination and intuition in conjunction with rational deductive capacities. Now, this process that I've just described or alluded to, of course, can seem arcane, and I suppose at points even alchemical in nature, until one considers those signal events and learning moments related to ethical issues having occurred in each of the three phases for oneself. For how, when, and why these certain events and experiences come into focus more than others remains frankly unclear to me. Joseph Carice, who's a senior person in medical ethics at Johns Hopkins, and colleagues, in an article noted, say the words regarding how ethics education imprints itself on students. Dr. Carice and colleagues say the following. The phenomenon of latency also must be considered in the assessment of ethics and professionalism instruction. Outcomes of interest may not manifest themselves for years. One goal of this kind of education, medical ethics education, is to prepare learners to address difficult ethical issues when they arise, yet learners may not encounter a particular ethics problem until years after they were taught about it in the classroom. However, their later performance may be profoundly affected by recollecting a distant reading or class discussion. Now, that could be a reach, but I think it's important to understand that the really important stuff we learn or we remember do imprint itself. I make this emphasis to students when they talk about issues at the end of life. I'd say, remember that. Sometimes that may work. Now, if such optimism, that is Professor Carice, Dr. Carice and others, is warranted, then it is useful to think back on the three phases of development and note what events, images, persons, issues, cases, errors, triumphs, and growth related to ethics occurred in each of these key phrases. And I would suggest to you a simple exercise is to make a list, keep a list, and share it if you wish, and continue to be surprised what you find. Now, in preparation for this presentation, I did my own retrospective inventory, and in fact, in the process of reflection, I came to discover something of how my experience of illness as a child, and I was a severe asthmatic, awakened me to questions that would later occupy my professional life in the teaching of bioethics. Could I trust my doctors? How was I to get along with the limitations my illness imposed upon me? Were my parents all right? All of you know anything about sick kids, there's a kind of a dance in a relationship where the child can become very protective of the parents' feelings and identities. Who were all these adults who were treating me? And did they really know what was going on? Now, what happened? I grew in my ability to quickly read moods, perceive levels of honesty, when to be on guard, and how it felt to be patient, literally patient, and to wait. Now, all these habits of mine have served me well. And I would suggest to you, this is from my own reflection, that this sounds a lot like the issues having to do, among other things, with trusting those who take care of you, assent and consent, and how it is we go about incorporating family members into treatment. The seeds are planted early, they become illuminated and built on as the life development goes forward. And providentially, both my pediatrician in the suburban town in New Jersey where I grew up, along with my specialist, whom I credit, frankly, with saving my life, had long-time associations with the New York hospital, where providentially I came many years after to spend the largest portion of my professional ministerial career. Now, I have another part of this that I'm not able to share final thoughts and rites of passage, but summarily it has to do with this, that there is a kind of rite of passage one goes through when you formally begin to enter the process of formally teaching this, and the kinds of anxieties and excitement that stirs up later becomes replicated when one goes to the next phase and the next stage and the next place where you go forward with doing this. So I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I think I've made it under just about 5 minutes. Good. Thank you all very much.